Hi, my name is Philip Adiatnia, and I'm a rising senior at the Hawkins School in Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm going to be providing a legislation overview for Legislation P2 on the 2015 NSDA Nationals docket, entitled A Bill to Expand Foreign Security Measures to Defeat the Islamic State. Now, the first thing I want to do is just say kudos to the Lone Star District, because this is a really good piece of legislation. Throughout the season, we oftentimes debate ISIS and how to deal with ISIS, and most of the time the debates are putting troops on the ground. But this piece of legislation does something very different. It does three things that you can actually very easily understand just by reading sections 1A, B, and C. First, it says that we're going to contain the Islamic State's social media outreach. Second, we're going to eliminate the Islamic State's oil installations in Syria to halt its financial resources. And three, we're going to train the Peshmerga forces, or the Kurdish forces, to strengthen military leadership. That's a pretty simple, group of goals. It's pretty understandable. So it's actually a very easy to understand bill. That's a really cool thing. That also is pretty cool because it means that the debate that's going to be had is going to be a good and substantive debate. Like what's occurred other times in the season, sometimes when there's bills to put troops on the ground or something like that, is sometimes people just stop at the title. They read the bill, they read the title of it, they're like, oh, this is another bill, to put troops on the ground or something like that. And so they're not paying attention to detail. But I think that people will pay attention to detail with this piece of legislation just because it's so easy to understand. So the debate that's going to happen is going to be pretty substantive. And for all of those reasons, I think this is going to be a bill that's going to be advanced pretty highly on many dockets. So it's definitely one that you should definitely prep. So I just wanted to go into in depth on what the bill does first. So in section 2, that's where that's the meat of this bill. So if we look at section 2A, it's saying that so that we can contain the Islamic State's social media outreach, we're going to be using something called the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, or CNCI, as the guiding framework to limit the Islamic State's social media propaganda. This can go either way. First of all, there's a lot of studies that say that CNCI hasn't really been that effective. Additionally, you have to consider that just means that CNCI is the guiding framework. How are we actually going to do it? We don't really know under today's legislation because, it's like base what you're going to do off of CNCI, but we're not actually using CNCI. So keep that in mind. So if you argue that the CNCI, the National Cybersecurity Initiative, has not worked, that's a good negative argument. If you're arguing that we don't know how this one's going to work, we don't know how it's going to be applied, that's a good argument. The other thing to remember about this entire bill is that this legislation does not allocate money towards these things. So if we're going to be doing something based on CNCI to counter ISIS's social media propaganda, that's fine. But just keep in mind that under Section 3, we're putting all of that under the Department of Homeland Security, which has its own issues, but additionally, we're not funding it at all. So DHS then has to take money that they allocated for other things, and they have to put it towards this. So how much are they going to put towards it? We don't know. How are they going to do it? We don't know. The legislation is a little vague there, and that's a pretty cool negative point to use. But aside from that, you can also argue that CNCI has been effective. There's plenty of literature on that, showing that it has been effective. That's a good point to run. And you can argue the need for countering propaganda, because that's the way that ISIS is recruiting people, is they're recruiting people through social media. That's where they're different than Al-Qaeda, for example. They are not doing the same sort of recruitment efforts as Al-Qaeda. They are very, very much living in the 21st century, as much as their beliefs on women's rights, for example, are more like 17th century, but they are recruiting people through social media, and so we have to take a multi-pronged approach. Many of the problems with previous bills where they were like, just put troops there and have them fight ISIS and that's going to solve everything. And that's not going to solve everything. What could solve the problem is the three-pronged approach that this legislation takes. So I focused a lot on the national cybersecurity thing. I want to move on to Section 2B, which is talking about Tomahawk cruise missiles, or in other words, it's talking about drone strikes. This legislation actually does not allocate anything else as in it doesn't do anything new. It just says the U.S. military will continue its strategy of deploying Tomahawk cruise missiles to target both stationary and mobile refineries. So the purpose of this is, so in reality, first of all, this legislation does nothing. Like in Section 2B, it does nothing. It's not doing anything. It's not changing anything. So if someone tries to argue that it's going to be good because this piece of legislation is going to suddenly change everything, a quick response to that is, no, it's not. We're literally keeping the same strategy. There's no differences whatsoever. Although, as long as people don't catch that, a point can be made that legislation is good because the cruise missiles have been effective. So here's the thing about drone strikes. Here's the nutshell of the argument, okay? Drone strikes are good because ISIS, first of all, can't shoot back. That's important. And it's not only just important because of human lives, but it's also important because of the social and kind of political implications. And here's what I mean by that. ISIS, essentially, whenever ISIS is able to have any sort of military victory on the ground over the Kurds or over us, it allows ISIS to instill fear in the people in those regions and tell them, hey, you should come and fight with us. So that's a thing. That's actually how they're getting people to join ISIS as well. So, but however, when you're using drone strikes, they can't like kill a drone. Like they can't shoot back. They can't really do anything. And so it gives us an advantage because it allows us to win, and at the very worst, we just don't win, but they never win. However, there are two sides to that coin, because drone strikes are actually being used as propaganda by ISIS, and here's what I mean. I mean that we make a lot of mistakes, honestly, when we use drone strikes, and many of these mistakes are pretty costly. For example, we've blown up weddings, we've killed children, lots of them actually. And so ISIS uses this as an opportunity to use this as kind of a propaganda advantage for them. So they tell people across Iraq that, hey, you can either side with the Iraqi government and by proxy the United States government, and they'll likely kill you, or you can join ISIS and we'll protect you. And as long as they can make that case, then they can make a grander case for the entire concept of the Islamic State. Remember, ISIS stands for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and they actually now go by IS, or Islamic State. They're not just trying to take over land, they're also trying to establish a government. That's why when they took over areas like, I believe, Kobani, they rather than going and rounding up all the people in the town they took over and being like, there you go, you're in the barracks, what they did instead was they took ISIS fighters and they made them crossing guards, and they threw community events and things like that, because they're actually trying to convince people in Iraq that ISIS is better than the Iraqi government. They're actually trying to win them over in that sense. And so whatever we can do to thwart them in that respect is going to be good. So that was a bit of a tangent, but back on the issue of drone strikes, ISIS uses that to make the case for people to join ISIS, and they do that very effectively. That's where drone strikes can be very detrimental to us. The other place where drone strikes can be very detrimental to us is actually in the Kurds. So in the third point that I'm going to mention in just a minute, we're talking about training the Peshmerga, and the reason why we're doing that is because the Kurds have been very effective. By very effective, I mean they've pushed back and taken almost 30% of ISIS lands, and we kind of haven't done anything. Like, the Kurds have been effective, they have been winning on the battlefield, and we haven't. So we want to support the Kurds. Now, an argument that I don't often hear on drone strikes that really is a cool argument that I like when people run it, I've run it a lot actually, is that a lot of times the mistakes that we make with drone strikes aren't just killing women and children and families and all that stuff. No, it's not just that. We also end up killing Kurds. So what happens is we're not paying attention when we're striking, and so we end up striking Kurdish bases. That's really important because that means that our drone strikes, rather than helping the Kurds, hurt the Kurds. But let's flip the coin for a second. On the other side, at the same time, using drone strikes can also help the Kurds, because if we take out oil installations, which is what this legislation advocates for, that's really helpful. So before I get into why that's helpful, I just want to make this very clear. It's very, very good in this bill to go and run that, yeah, idealistically it would be good to go and blow up all those oil installations, but that's not the reality. The reality is we're going to end up blowing up families, and we're going to end up blowing up the Kurds. That's a really compelling argument to make. But let's assume that the drones will work. in terms of blowing up oil installations. Why does that matter? Why do you want to blow up oil installations? Here's why. ISIS gets its money from selling oil. They take over all these oil fields all across Iraq, and they take that oil and they sell it, and that's how they get the money to get their weapons and to get all that stuff. You take away the oil installations, you take away their ability to make money. You take away their ability to make money, they can't buy as many guns, and they can't buy as many tanks, and they can't get any of that stuff. That impairs them on the battlefield. That means that the Kurds can win, and that means that we can win. So that's important. So a good affirmative advocacy is arguing that by curbing them on the point on propaganda, by curbing their propaganda, by destroying their oil installations, and then also by trading the Peshmerga, through doing all of those three things, you are targeting them and winning against them on every front that they're battling on. And that's a really cool point. So I want to move on to the third and final point, which is the Peshmerga. The Peshmerga are the Kurdish forces. A little bit of background on the Kurds, because honestly I didn't know much about them before I started debate. The Kurds are a group of people that exist in Iraq, but also all across the Middle East. They've wanted their country. They've wanted their own country for a long period of time. They're basically an ethnic group, and the Kurds as well have actually their own government, even though they don't have their own country. They own a lot of oil. I mean, they're advanced. This is not just any group of people. If you ever hear around someone cite Rudaw or Rudaw, that's the Kurdish news agency. Like they're legit. And they're a cool force because they've also been very effective fighting against ISIS. As I mentioned before, they've taken like 30% of ISIS land. So what we do in Section 3 is we train the Peshmerga to strengthen military leadership. And there's some important things that you got to pay attention to here. First of all, it says that the U.S. Special Operations Forces will use the $250,000 budget designated from foreign military financing for Iraq to train the Peshmerga. So you need to pay very close attention to this, because this is a point of contention that I don't think is going to be brought up, but I think it is important to bring it up. And so if you're the first neg or whatever, you bring this up. You have to bring this up, because it is something that is going to turn against the affirmative unless someone can make an answer. Here's what I mean by that. What we're doing is we're taking all of the money that we're spending on training Iraqi soldiers, and we're shifting it so that we're now training the Kurdish forces. Ooh, wow. That basically means that we just abandoned Iraq. And there is an affirmative case to be made for that. You can argue that, well, the Iraqi forces, we're training them, but then they go into battle and then they just flee, which is true. The Iraqi forces basically have been total cowards on the battlefield. That's pretty clear. Part of it could be that they're just not trained well enough. Part of it is just they just suck on the battlefield. So that's a thing. So there is an affirmative case to be made that we should be spending that money on the Kurds. But just keep in mind that we're taking the entire budget that we're allocating to the Iraqis, taking it away from them, and allocating it to the Kurds. So that's a major shift in policy, and it's something that I think it's easier to argue on the negative than it is on the affirmative. That doesn't mean don't argue it on the affirmative. That just means it's easier to argue on the negative. So you're taking all that money, you're allocating it to the Peshmerga. It's easier on the negative to argue that's a bad thing because we should be supporting both rather than taking all of our money from one and giving it to the other. The other thing is the Kurds want their state really, really badly. So badly, in fact, they're willing to fight against the Iraqis to do it. If we're empowering the Kurds too much, let's say that we deal with ISIS, okay? And ISIS is defeated, and everybody's happy, and everybody goes home. It means that the Kurds they will carve out their own country if they know how to do it, if they can fight in a war against the Iraqis. Why does that matter? Because without the Kurdish regions of Iraq can basically suffer an entire financial collapse. Like, they need the Kurdish regions. Otherwise, Iraq can't be a thriving country. So there's a lot of issues there. The Kurds are our friends here, but just remember, and I'm not trying to make an equivalency, they are not equivalent in any way, but we have a bad track record when it comes to backing organizations for a period of time. Like, think about it. Back when we were, remember that at one point we funded the Mujahideen, which became Al-Qaeda. So we funded Al-Qaeda at one point because it helped us. There's a case to be made that funding the Kurds right now because it helps us is a similar mistake. So that's certainly a point that should be brought up in the debate. Other than that, the legislation really doesn't do anything else. There are other points to run on it, but I think that the points that I've told you here are probably the biggest points of contention. The legislation is very straightforward, and I think it's going to come up very highly in debate.